If you don't want it to ship, make it hot pink. Unless you're making a game like Splatoon, then you can leave it. So here's just a quick overview of what we're going to go over tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about Turtle Rock, who I am, what I do, and then what exactly is a producer. I have time for questions in here, but we can obviously pause to match the agenda that Naz has. So, Turtle Rock Studios. We were founded initially in 2003, and then we were purchased by Valve, and then actually we split off. So the version of Turtle Rock Studios that exists right now is 2.0, which I would argue is the better version. We work on multiple different platforms. We've got titles that are on PC, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, VR, iOS, Android, and we'll probably end up on next-gen stuff once that stuff gets announced and is official. We are located in Lake Forest, so it's a short drive to get here. And these are just some of our games. So we've worked on Counter-Strike in the past, and Left 4 Dead as well, if you guys are familiar with that one. And then we do have other games which I'm going to mention later on because they're a part of my personal history. So we're currently 110 employees. I think we're pretty beautiful. We really like GIFs, and I apologize in advance for using them in this presentation. I also hope that you really like the color purple because I do. Our culture at Turtle Rock is extremely important to us. Gameplay is king, so everything that we do and the way that we prioritize work is to ensure that the game or the experience that we're making is as fun as possible. A lot of people interested in production or game development may talk to you about different production methodologies like Scrum or Kanban or Waterfall, but we actually don't follow one to the letter. That's the kind of thing where they work really well in a vacuum. Like, you guys are learning a lot of theories here at school. They work really well in vacuums, but in practice, they kind of break down pretty quickly. So every game team at Turtle Rock actually operates slightly differently as a result of this. This is because their deadlines, their goals, the people that are on those teams are all different. So you have to adapt to the team to help them work best. And that's something that we do at Turtle Rock pretty well, I think. The other thing that's really important to us is transparency. And what that means at Turtle Rock is we are extremely open with everything that's going on at a business level at Turtle Rock. So if we're having issues on a business side or it's taking a while to sign the contract, we're extremely open with all of our employees so that all of the decisions that they make for themselves and their families, they have all the information that they need. So one of the things that we do that a lot of studios actually don't, we work with publishers, which means that we're on a milestone schedule, so we deliver milestones in some cadence. And with every milestone that we deliver, we receive written feedback. And that feedback says whether or not the milestone was approved, how much the company was paid for it, and then all of the issues that the publisher had with it, as well as anything that was good with it. So one of the things that we do is we actually go through it, we write out all of Turtle Rock's responses, which are, we agree with you on this, we disagree with you here, and then we share that with the entire team. So our development team is seeing how much we're getting paid for every milestone, they're seeing exactly what the publisher is concerned about, and they're seeing what our official response is to it so they know whether or not to freak out. This is actually pretty rare at game companies, and it's something that we're extremely proud of. So my path into games. At the age of 4, my brothers had set up our Tandy computer to accept my name as input, so I would type in Lianne, and then it would prompt me 1 for Mixed Up Mother Goose and 2 for California Dreams. These were both very good games. You guys should check them out. Sorry, I lost the cursor here, if you can help me out. I still game now. Right now I play World of Warcraft. I am a healer main. Oh, I must have gone all the way over. Sorry about this, thank you. I'm also playing Persona 5, which is a really weird game, if any of you have played it. JRPGs are so not my thing, but for whatever reason this game is just captivating enough that I'm really enjoying it. I actually used to want to be a lawyer, but then I got better. I went to school for computing science, and leading up to graduation and shortly after, I actually started working as an engineer. I thought I wanted to be a graphics programmer, and I had all these awesome ideas for what my master's thesis would be, but I had this awful professor, and he made it really hard for me to get into it. But part of the blame is also on me, right? Because I wasn't passionate enough to pursue it. So as I was working as an engineer, my projects were primarily web apps. I did scheduling software for a factory in Germany, so I can tell you about really weird floating point errors in Java. I helped create political software that enabled campaign volunteers to call constituents and gather data. It was as boring as it sounds, but I learned a lot. What's really cool is at this company, we actually used Scrum. We used an actual whiteboard where we had Post-it notes, and I found the whole process of project management really interesting. So I decided to go back to school, and I got an after degree in business. And this is where I learned finance, accounting, negotiation. That was a really good class. People management courses, so human resource style things. And then once I graduated, I was ready to enter the game industry, and I insisted on starting in production because that's what I wanted to do. Most people that end up in production or in games, they might start in QA. No way into the industry is the right way. You kind of find what works best for you and just do it. So I got hired at a studio called Timegate Studios in Houston as an associate producer. Kind of a little funny story is when I applied and they brought me in for an interview, they were actually hoping to bait and switch me so that I would work there as an engineer. But I insisted on being a producer, and fortunately they gave me a shot. One of my first tasks was to help coordinate a bunch of launch and post-launch items for the online infrastructure and stats system we were doing with an external group for Section 8. Section 8 is kind of a planet-side inspired shooter. We had jetpacks and you shot around. I worked a 12-hour day on my second day, and I thought this was pretty normal because of the reputation the game industry has. It's not normal. Don't accept that. A little information on Timegate itself. It was owned by a guy who also owned and ran a infusion therapy company, and he had extra money, and he thought he was a game designer, so he said to himself, I'm going to start a game company. Some of the games that came out of there were pretty good, but kind of the way he operated is he would review the games that we were working on and come down for these executive reviews every once in a while, and then just mandate changes. Like, I died really fast, up the health, and it was like, okay, we have to do that. So one of the things that he had come up with was this MMO world. He had all these ideas, it was this fantasy world, and he really wanted to work on an MMO. So I was put on this team as the associate producer with 0 games experience, none. And I was working with a senior engineer, senior game designer, senior artist, and we were supposed to put together a prototype and define a backlog for what it would take to do this MMO. So I read books, I figured it out, I worked with them, and then I presented the plan to the leadership team, and the project was predictably deemed too expensive. MMOs are not easy things to make. So that project got canceled, and then I was put onto Section 8 Prejudice to support the engineering or feature side of things. I ended up managing the backlog, providing metrics to the leadership team, showing the team's velocity and whether or not work would fit. So I got promoted to project manager and then assigned to this project called Aliens Colonial Marines. And yes, that one. It had a 45% Metacritic rating. And you might think that I would tell you that I regret working on it because it was such a weird project and there was so much going on. But I actually learned most of my lessons from this project, so I wouldn't change things. I learned how to make games, and I learned how not to make games. I learned how to communicate with external parties, because we were actually contracted by Gearbox Studios to work on this. The lead engineer and I at the time had correctly predicted most of the issues that the game's schedule would have, and what would have to be shoved in last minute. But unfortunately, most of our reports to not only our management, but Gearbox and Sega, the publisher, ended up being ignored. So about 6 months prior to ship, I was moved to another project called Minimum that was intended to be a free-to-play third-person shooter. I guess the company felt I was really good at kicking off projects, so that's what I kept doing. 3 months after Aliens shipped, Timegate closed due to bankruptcy, unrelated to the Aliens fiasco. Timegate being the only game company in Houston, it was time for me to move. I'll spare you my personal life details, but it was decided to move to California because there are so many game companies here. I wanted to go to like a hub. So this little story is to show you guys how it's worth sticking in there. So when I was done at Timegate, I had 4 years of game experience. And I actually had a really difficult time finding a job. Turtle Rock was my 47th job application. I had a spreadsheet. I like spreadsheets. And I had actually applied to their outsourced manager position. After finding out that they had made Left 4 Dead, I was kind of like, oh my god, I have to work at this company. So, game industry, really small. Very few degrees of separation between people. Thanks to an engineer that I worked with at Timegate, he put in a good word for me with engineers at Turtle Rock and scored me an interview. So I was really lucky, they picked me up. I joined the Evolve development team. about midway through Evolve, and I helped grow the team from 50 to 126 Turtle Rock employees to finalize and eventually ship Evolve. With the productions team specifically, there were 2 producers when I started, and I grew the team to 10. We're 7 now, but we had quite a few folks there. Shortly after Evolve shipped, I was promoted into the executive producer position, where I have since overseen a lot of different titles. We did our transition of Evolve to a free-to-play title on PC, and shortly after that, we also started some VR teams to work on Gear VR projects. Face Your Fears quickly became the #1 experience on Gear VR. I think it actually is still the #1, and we added several more doors and experiences to it over the next year. The Gear VR projects were really cool because most of the team had come off of Evolve, which was like 5 to 6 year development cycle, and then you add on the free-to-play conversion, which is roughly another year. These projects were 3 to 4 months, so it was really cool because from like design to concept, or from concept to design to implementation and ship was like 4 months. It was so cool to be able to like put your work out there right away and see what people thought about it. We also worked on Blade Runner Replicant Pursuit, so you mentioned you like the movie. This was really cool. During the development of this, we were working closely with the movie studio, and we got to see all the set pieces and the car models, and they were like sending us stuff, and they were super restrictive about it. We had to put a computer into like a closet with a lockable door so that not just anyone could go in and like walk off with game files. We also worked on an RPG called The Well. So this is on the Oculus Go. And then right now we have Journey of the Gods and Face Your Fears 2 that are going to be coming out on the Oculus Quest very soon, actually on Tuesday. So that's pretty exciting. We also worked on several prototypes that never saw the light of day, and I unfortunately can't give you any information about them, but I'll have a couple stories related to some of them. I just can't tell you which. And then we are also working on Black for Blood right now, so if you're a Left 4 Dead fan, you should definitely keep an eye on news for that. It's worth noting that in your career in games, you may end up working on multiple titles that never ship. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can definitely be a little discouraging though, because when you apply places and you put it on your resume, you know all the titles you worked on, and it sucks when it's unannounced, unannounced, unannounced. But that's okay, because you're still learning, you're still growing, you're still practicing. So what do I specifically do at Turtle Rock? So as mentioned, I'm the executive producer. This means different things at different companies and also in different industries. So I'm talking specifically about Turtle Rock here. So I lead the production department. So this means that I lead the team and I represent the department. As I mentioned, we're currently 7 people. We are going to be hiring on more, and we are specifically going to be hiring on people that have 0 games industry experience. So keep an eye out for openings if you're interested in that. I deal with project scope. So when we're pitching a game to a publisher, part of that is defining the project scope as a part of the budget, then helping manage changes to that scope throughout the project. So while we as a development team, we own the game idea, we are also responsible for that scope. So that includes fielding scope changes both internally and externally. So sometimes the publishers make requests, sometimes, most of the time, your internal designers are making requests. So it's all about figuring out, does it fit, can we do it? The other thing that I help manage is development processes. So I mentioned that there's no one way to make games at Turtle Rock, but we sometimes want to add process or changes to address an inefficiency or a specific issue. As an executive team at Turtle Rock, we're careful that anything that we're adding doesn't compromise our culture. So sometimes people say, oh, I always get really frustrated, you know, they keep forgetting this one thing, let's create a checklist. No. Let's solve the problem, let's talk to the person, let's figure out what's going on. Why are they forgetting it? Community support. This is something I especially enjoy helping out with. I like being active in our Discord and on social in general. And what I try to do is work closely with our community team, and Alyssa, our community manager, is actually here today. My goal is to ensure that they have all the information that they need so that they can execute on their vision for the game. Because sometimes at other companies, they keep community in the corner, or actually the developer won't have a community manager and they rely on the publisher for that. I bet your ass they don't know what's going on, they don't know the latest change, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to make sure doesn't happen, because to us, community is a part of the team, because we're all part of the community. Budgeting. So pitches or significant changes to a game schedule often require a budget, and you might be asking what exactly goes into a budget. This kind of thing is resource schedules. who's on the project and for how long, what roles, when do they ramp on, do they ramp off. It includes extra costs like VO, music, middleware, engine licensing, sound effect libraries, outsourcing. A lot of this is a guesstimate, but it's based on our experience and the things that we've learned in the past. So we might come off a project and go, oh, that just wasn't enough time, so we'll try to add a little bit more time, or that wasn't enough budget for music, so we'll try to add more. Team staffing and performance. So kind of similar to the budget, I help ensure that the teams get the help they need, particularly in terms of new team members. So the way that we determine this is the previously mentioned resource schedules. That's how we know we're going to have to hire on, and we track who's filling what slots. But sometimes we end up changing the plan. So right now on one of our projects, we actually ended up realizing as we built more of the game that we would need more environment artists or world builders as we refer to them. And we realized that we actually didn't need as many character artists as we thought we would. So we actually repurposed a couple of those slots so that we would be able to switch them over and provide the team exactly what they need. You do have to watch out for things first, like salary, because we do track an average salary for a position, so you can't switch a QA role to an engineering role very easily. It's not out of the question, but my GM gets a little upset when I try to do that. On the performance side of things, it's making sure that we're moving forward at a reasonable pace and that any personnel issues that come up are resolved. The unfortunate reality is that sometimes an underperformer or hugely negative team member is affecting the team in a bad way, so I try to make sure that those issues are resolved. You guys might get told in your group projects that you have to deal with the person that's underperforming and not doing well, but in the real world, those people can get fired. Middleware, contracting, and outsource liaison. So along with our tech director, I help the team in securing middleware they want to use for the project. If you don't know what middleware is, it's additional software or plugins that help us create the game. It's usually tedious stuff or things that aren't included in the game engine. So one example is creating LODs is a pain in the butt. So you might get a tool that's able to automatically generate them, hopefully to the satisfaction of the art team. Contractors and outsourcers are also often needed for larger projects. This is something that we leverage to keep the team from ballooning too much. So I think most game companies are moving away from this, but for a long time, common practice was at the peak of the project when you know the game that you're making, you just need to create all these world assets, you need to create all these characters. They would hire on a ton of people, bring them into the studio, and they would work them, and then you would hit this point where you didn't have work for them anymore, and they were like, oh, well, all right, and they would lay them off. We're fortunately, I think, starting to move away from that because that's a pretty shitty practice. So one of the things that I do is when people come to me and say, hey, Lianne, I need more world builders, I need a lighting artist, I need this, I ask them for how long. And if it's a 6 months first, then I might ask them, is it okay if they're outside of the studio, in which case an outsourcer is okay. At Turtle Rock, if we're making somebody a job offer, we're extremely clear as to whether or not we intend for that position to be full-time. If it can't be, we'll be honest. We had to bring on an environment artist once for a project, and we were super open with him. We said, hey, we only have work for you until February. In January, let's touch base, or December, let's touch base, and we'll either confirm that or we can extend it. And last but certainly not least, publisher relations. So I mentioned earlier that all of our projects at Turtle Rock are financed by publishers, which means that they come with a milestone schedule and some relationship management. Part of my job is defining that milestone schedule with them, and it's where they kind of come to me and they say, we think you should have this much, and I'll push back as much as I can. We have to show significant progress, which is reasonable, but I also don't want to sign the team up for too much. On our VR projects, our publisher has actually been very easy to work with. We work with Oculus there, so management from me has been minimal. I actually let the producers that work directly on those projects manage most of that. But we're currently working with Warner Brothers for Back 4 Blood, and they actually take up quite a bit more of my time. That's because they have a lot of different departments. I generate a lot of reports, and kind of my goal and my role is to handle as much of that communication as possible so that the rest of the team can focus on making a kick-ass game. So kind of in summary, my job is to have a view of the forest, or the 10,000-foot view, and then I deep dive as needed. All right, so you know about me, but what is game production? Does anyone want to give a shot at answering this? Now?
It's more like you're just yelling out the time and the pacing of production for the game, and also taking in financial milestones that the designers has to take into account in order to figure out how he is going to finish a certain point of the game in that time frame.
That's a pretty good answer. So he says it's timing and scaling of the project, making sure you're working at the right pace, and then factoring the financial requirements of milestones and communicating that to the designers so they know how to meet it. That's more commonly for free-to-play games or games that are KPI-driven, which is they need to have a certain amount of new users or income generated, revenue. In our game model, it's a little more traditional in that we go to them and we say, hey, we think the project is going to take this much, and it gets divided up into a bunch of milestones. We deliver the milestone, and the publisher goes, check, 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 check. Okay, here's your money. So we go to the designers and the rest of the team, we go, these are your requirements, we have to fulfill this. But it's a conversation. If something doesn't work, that's okay. All right, so I'm going to give you a required disclosure, which is the following opinions and statements expressed here are my own and are not representative of all game production. And then here's my rudimentary analogy. I tell people that producers are like kindergarten teachers. We herd cats, and we're the adults in the room. GIF. A wise person once said, if everyone could communicate clearly, I wouldn't have a job. That wise person was me. So what is a game producer? We are shepherds. This is not the Mass Effect shepherd. We're literally goat or sheep herders. We make sure that people are staying on task, they're on the right path, and that they're getting together when needed. We're a leader. Though not exactly in a lead position, producers are expected to lead the pack. If you tend to be the one in your friends or school group that tends to push for decisions or make a call in the lack of a decision, you may find that you'd be a good producer. Similarly, if you're always the friend or family member that comes up with a plan in the absence of none, or just like to, production might be for you. You always have to be thinking ahead of the team. And just having a plan doesn't mean that you can't react when the plan changes. I always have a backup. Facilitator. You need to coordinate between groups, and you need to resolve roadblocks not only when they come to your attention, but before they become a reality. You need to be a communicator. Another term I could have used here is information radiator. This means emails, meeting notes, instant messages, and going to people's desks. Making sure people are talking and making sure that people are informed. Part of this is also recognizing that different people work or think differently. And you may have to change how you disseminate information to those people. Just because they're not understanding the way that you're communicating it isn't a problem with them or necessarily with you. You kind of got to work through that. You also have to be a mediator. Sometimes someone asks for something that doesn't fit. Most of the time it doesn't fit. Or it compromises with another feature in the game. So you have to help them negotiate. It might be an artist feels that water is extremely important, but that's too high of a cost on the performance side. So then something else has to give. You have to be a juggler. You have to fulfill all of these roles and be able to jump from task to task. And being tolerant of changing your focus midstream is extremely important. Of all of the people at a game studio, the producer must be interruptible, and you can't get upset when you're being interrupted. You have to be a protector. So it said that people can take up to 27 minutes to refocus their efforts once they've been interrupted. Knowing when people are busy and shouldn't be bothered is important. And you also have to make sure that what's being asked of members of the team isn't going to compromise their well-being. We are one of the last lines of defense against crunch, and I am going to talk about crunch later. We have to fight for our team and their needs. Sometimes publishers will ask us for unreasonable things, and I've had to fight for the team before. But the tough thing here is recognizing when I have to acquiesce to them, and this can take a lot of experience, and it depends on the publisher as well. You have to be a cheerleader. We're all probably very quick to identify and assign blame when doing school or work projects. Producers must also be quick to celebrate victories and remind the team why we do what it is that we do. We have to be positive representatives of not only our internal teams, but also help the team look at groups like publishers and external QA in a positive light. When you're shipping a game and you're working with external QA, your development team fucking hates QA, especially external QA, because a lot of the bugs that they send through, it feels like, oh, they don't understand how much work I have. They don't care how much work you have, and they shouldn't. They're supposed to report everything to you to help make an awesome game, and it's up to the team to say, I want to fix that or not. So part of what we have to do in our role is make sure that the team doesn't generate this negative opinion of them, because kind of what happens is they look at a bug from external and they don't want to do it because they're just upset with the source of it, when really we should just focus on what are we trying to make and how awesome do we want it to be. Lastly, you should be a barometer. So because producers have a high-level view of the game and we're privy to everything that's going on, it's important to always appear even-keeled, calm, and confident. If you see a producer with their hair on fire, something's wrong. And that's an easy way for panic or negativity to spread. And sometimes you don't even mean it. Maybe you're having a bad day because your dog shit on the carpet and you go, and if you like seem frustrated, people are gonna mistakenly think you're upset about the game. And that has caused rumors. I've had rumors come to me where I was like, what? Why? That's so weird. So you have to keep track of that kind of thing. So it means no crying under your desk while drinking at work. Save that for your car, don't drink and drive, or save it for home. So kind of in summary for the gamers out there, as a producer, you have to be able to operate as a tank, a healer, and DPS. Sometimes you gotta protect your team, sometimes you've gotta help lift them up, sometimes you have to go on the attack. All right, qualities of a quality producer. So a common misconception in production is that if you're constantly handling fires, you're an effective producer. And this is a really easy trap to fall into, especially as an AP or production coordinator. You're like, yeah, I'm fighting all these fires and helping all these people that are coming up to me. Really, you should be trying to prevent those fires, which is where being a proactive individual comes into play. You need to be able to balance daily fires, long-term planning, and issue prevention. Fires are gonna happen, but you also have to recognize like, hey, I have to stop and also move these long-term threats. You have to be aware. You have to be aware of what's going on with the team. One of the requirements that I have of producers on my team is you need to be able to answer a question I have about the status of a thing or something that you're following within an hour of me asking. Because if you can't, chances are you don't know what's going on and that something is probably about to go wrong. You have to be intuitive. So a big part of this is being able to sniff out the bullshit. This isn't typical, but when I first started in the industry, I would have engineers who would assume that I didn't know things, and they would try to overcomplicate systems when talking to me. I think their goal was either to gain more time or prove their superiority over me. So it's important that when someone's talking to you that you're able to kind of sense, like, this isn't, like, they're not confident in it, or they're trying to pull one over me. So you have to trust your gut. And if something seems off or wrong, it probably is. So just ask questions. You have to be forward thinking. So similar to intuitive and proactive, you need to be able to imagine a lot of different scenarios. Especially as you get to know your team, you might know that two people tend to clash, and you're kind of just waiting for the next time for them to clash. You have to think multiple steps ahead, imagine how things will play out. You have to try to anticipate the needs of your team before they realize and vocalize them themselves. Sometimes you can seem pretty godlike if you can do that. You have to be informed. So this is very similar to being aware. You have to ask questions and find information. But especially as a producer, before you start bothering people, I always encourage you to look at an email, an IM conversation, or documentation so that they're not just like, yeah, here it is, and they pull up Confluence. You have to be patient. So I wrote here, at least a little. This is a dig on me. I know I'm not the most patient person in the world. And because I've recognized that, I've actually come up with mechanisms for dealing with that. So some people need more time to deal with things, and it's not super urgent to wrap up a thread, but like I want to because it's on my list and I want to check it off. So something that I do is I might maintain new lists, or I'll set up a bunch of reminders for myself so that I feel like I'm still pushing it forward, but I'm not irritating the people that don't want me at their desk every day. You have to be flexible. So if you ask most producers what a typical day looks like, they'll either laugh or tell you, well, I get to work, roll with them, and adapt quickly. You shouldn't have one way of doing things or working with people. Developers are all unique, and it's important to be able to change your style to best work with them. So unless someone is being unreasonable, intentionally difficult, or malicious, you shouldn't expect them to change to adapt to the way that you like to work. You should be changing the way they like to work. And lastly, you need to be flexible with your own assumptions and learnings. Learn and adapt as you go through experiences with the team. Especially if you're new to the industry, you're gonna learn a lot about how games are made or how people like to operate. You gotta remember those and build them into your decision making. you have to be humble. So similar to being needing to be flexible, you need to be able to admit when you've made a mistake. This is huge. If you like mess up and you're able to go to people and say, hey guys, I messed up, I'm really sorry, this is what we're gonna do moving forward, you'll gain a lot of respect and trust from doing that. The other part of being humble is you need to be able to go into a room full of experts and ask the stupid question. There are so many times where I'll have a bunch of like technical designers and engineers talking about something, and I'll ask a really simple question like, did you guys think of doing it this way? And they're all like, oh, yeah. Because they think it's a complicated problem. Like a lot of people automatically assume that it's a hard problem and therefore it requires a complex solution, but that's not always the case. So you might feel like it's a stupid question, but ask it. It's okay, they'll get used to it. Last, certainly not least, you have to be approachable. So game development is extremely collaborative at most studios, and especially at Turtle Rock. It's important that people feel like they can approach you and not get their heads ripped off. I'll admit at times when we were shipping products, especially when we were shipping Evolve's whole leading up to ship was pretty rough. And sometimes people would come up to me and I was super stressed out. I hadn't been sleeping because I was up till like 3 or 4 in the morning trying to get it built out. And they would ask me what I felt at the time was a really stupid question. And I let them know how inconvenienced I felt. Afterwards, I realized my misstep and I would send them a quick IM, which was like, I'm really sorry, I'm super stressed out, there's a lot going on. And I would maybe answer the question if I hadn't, depending on how stressed I was. It's okay to mess up on this, but you have to own it. If you never go to people and say, hey, I didn't mean to do this, they're just gonna assume that that's the way you are all the time, and they'll get to the point where they just won't bother talking to you because it's not a pleasant experience. All right, so I wanna talk a little bit about some myths about producers out there. I know they exist within the game industry. I don't know if you guys have heard them at all with your experience, but if you're bad at making things, but you want to work in games, you should become a producer. As I covered in the previous very long slides, producers aren't just people that couldn't do anything else. The best producers, at least in my opinion, are those that get a rush from facilitating and organizing things. My husband and I often joke pretty seriously that I am his life producer. I love making sure that things are in order. I do things like create Excel spreadsheets for when we're going on vacation that like lays out all the stuff that's planned. But I'm flexible with changes to the plan. Some people might not think so, but I try to be. So I usually have alternatives ready to go as well. They don't do anything. They just send emails, book meetings, and update Jira. We do send emails, we do book meetings, and we do update Jira. But it's a lot more than that when we're good at our job. One of the tricky things with game production is if you are at a minimum doing this, the average developer will not know that you are not performing as well as you can or providing as much as you can to the team. They push their own agendas, not what's good for the game. So personally, I strongly believe in a clear separation of creative design and production, kind of like checks and balances in a functioning government. Design at Turtle Rock is production's primary client, so they're the ones that are coming and they're saying, hey, I want this, this, and this. And I'm supposed to be the one that says, this is reasonable, or, okay, can we scale this back? Can we exchange these things? If I was the one coming up with the cool ideas, and I control the resources, and I control the schedule, that's pretty messed up. Like, there's nothing there to keep it, I can't think of the word right now, but it doesn't work, and that's how things get off kilter pretty quickly, and games can feel disjointed pretty fast. So if you're a producer pushing your own agenda, you're doing so at the detriment of the game, probably. You might think you're making all the right decisions, but you're probably not. Also, Jira is awesome. All right, so whenever you're talking about games, especially now, I'm sure you guys are reading a lot of the articles on Kotaku and stuff like that. I think it's really important to acknowledge and talk about crunch. So as a producer, if you accept that crunch is inevitable, your team has already lost. So my personal goal is to prove otherwise. I don't think that a AAA title must include crunch to be great. I think that's crap. But that being said, small concentrated bursts of overtime can result in gains, but long, unorganized, endless, goalless crunch destroys people. And when it comes to crunch, production plays a huge role. So I have 2 stories for you. First, Sorry, no. I want to explain kind of the difference between the two things, sorry. So a long, endless crunch is kind of the kind of thing that you think about when you hear the stories like from Rockstar with working towards Red Dead. There's no end in sight, there's no clear guideline. They're saying to you, you must be in the studio from this time to this time. So when I worked at TimeGate, we would do crunch. It was like 5 or 6 months at a time, sometimes longer. And it was, you must work from 9 to 9, Monday to Saturday. And it was very like clear about what it was supposed to be. And what that turned into is actually that people would take longer lunches. They would go to lunch for 2 hours. They would go to dinner. And they actually got less work done in a day than if they had been working a regular 8-hour schedule. And kind of one of the interesting things at TimeGate too is, I mentioned earlier I did a lot of metrics gathering there. I got really good with estimating the velocity of the team, so I could tell you how quickly they would get through a chunk of work based off of all this data. And I kept tracking that kind of data as we crunched, and our velocity actually dropped significantly during overtime when we theoretically should be getting more work done than we were in a regular 8-hour day. And part of the problem there is also like, when you're tired and you're submitting bugs and you're staying up until 2 in the morning doing stuff, you're actually generating more bugs than if you had done it when you were well rested. And I see you all nodding, you all understand that. With the short, concentrated bursts, the way that we do it at Turtle Rock is, if we determine that crunch is needed, we have to be able to answer a couple questions. What is the goal of the crunch? What are you trying to achieve? What defines, okay, we're done? What is the deadline? When do you want to hit that? And what does the team kind of get at the end of it? So here's an example of what I deem an unavoidable crunch. One of the projects, which I won't disclose what or with who, we were working towards a prototype milestone. And 3 months prior, we'd explained to the publisher that the prototype would be a complete mission with grayscale art. So no textures, no final models, or anything like that. So you'd have to imagine what the world looked like. But we guaranteed that the gameplay would be fun. And one of the things that we feel is like we don't focus on art very quickly at Turtle Rock. We do our concepts and we start generating a character to find out what that bar is. But we recognize that art isn't what makes your game fun. It will elevate your game, it will build atmosphere, and it'll help define a mood. But it doesn't somehow flip the switch from this game sucks to, hey, this game's great, this art's awesome. So with this prototype, publisher knew that we were going to do grayscale. 6 weeks prior to that delivery, we were informed that certain high-level executives would be viewing the milestone and that we needed to have art, otherwise they wouldn't understand anything. We could debate all day long whether or not those executives actually were that stupid, but the publisher, and whether or not the publisher knew we were going to do gray box or not, or whether they knew that we were going to need the art or not, none of that matters. So I had a lot of discussions with my points of contact at the publisher, like argued with them. I was like, you're asking for a lot, this is extremely unreasonable, we were very clear. But we hit this point where it was very clear to me that whether or not we hit this requirement was a contingent of whether or not the project was extended. So that's the point where I was like, crap, I have to acquiesce, we have to do this. So I got together with the rest of the leadership team, I explained everything, I was like, yes, I did push back, and we came up with a plan and then communicated it to the team. And what we said to them was, this is what we need to achieve. Figure out how you want to do your own hours. Do you want to stay late? Do you want to come early in the morning? Do you want to work on the weekend? We ordered dinner for them. We would cover lunch. And as soon as you're through your tasks, you're done. You can go back to your regular hours. When you treat the developers like an adult like that, we saw something very interesting, which was actually as soon as Joe got through all of his tasks, he was looking at his coworkers and going, can I help you? Can I help you bring it down? Because we all knew if we could get it done together, we would end it. And not only that, once we submitted it and we got it approved, we gave everyone a week off. So there was a light at the end of the tunnel, like they knew we were gonna celebrate what it is that they had to do, and we were honest with them, and they helped each other out. We treated them like adults, I guess is like the important part here. Now, this other story I want to tell you is actually about avoidable crunch, which we successfully avoided. So we were just recently working towards another major milestone. It was our vertical slice, so we had to have fully arted stuff. And my environment art lead came to me and was like, Lianne, there's too much work. Like, we need to crunch. I need the guys to stay super late. And I was like, prove it. So he sat down with some of my senior producers. They generated all the data. These are all the things that we want to get done. This is how much it's going to take. This is how many people we have. This is whether or not it fits. So it didn't fit. But then they looked at it and they were like, this isn't important, this isn't important. And we actually got the workload down to a point where they did not have to crunch, and they were confident that they were able to get their stuff done. So just by asking those simple questions, like prove it, explain to me, walk me through it, you can avoid it. Because if we just listened to my environment early, that team would have been crunching unnecessarily to hit something. And you don't want to do that early in a project. Like, you have to set a pace for your game that's sustainable. Because if you're constantly crunching, you're gonna hate it. Like when I was working at TimeGate, I went home, I was so tired of catered dinners, like I just wanted to cook myself a meal and sleep. And that was all I wanted to do, and that just sucks. So production can help and can avoid crunch, but sometimes you can't, but there's a way to do it. I can talk about this a lot more. I'm really passionate about this kind of thing, but there's one thing I want you guys to take away as folks entering into the game industry. When you're applying to jobs, ask about crunch at that studio and push them until they answer your question. This is a small way that you can help our industry and help yourselves as well. Because part of why they're able to get away with this is because they know that they can fill that seat with someone that's willing to do it. But the more you ask about it and the more you get them to explain why or how they ended up getting there, they'll start to feel like they have to look into it. They have the onus to be better for their employees. All right, so I mentioned crunch, and one of the things that's worth talking about is our production superpowers. So you get a higher level view, insight into confidential topics. So I mentioned that publisher came to us with all this feedback. My producers and my leads were the first ones to hear it. You're the first to know, so also kind of flies into that. You get to operate with great decision-making power. Kind of the way that I've put it with talking with other people is that producers actually operate at a higher level in the hierarchy. Because you know the schedule and you're making calls on stuff like that, you actually often get to overrule a lead or an art director on things. You just can't abuse that power. You also get to speak with the voice of authority. An AP comes in and says something about the schedule, and if they're a well-known AP and they know stuff, senior engineers and senior artists are going to listen to them because the voice of production, when trusted, is one that is the voice of authority. But there is a catch to all of our powers. The source of our power is trust. So if you don't have trust as a producer, you don't get to use any of those superpowers. The team doesn't talk to you, they don't confide in you, and they don't utilize you. But if you establish trust with them and you build a strong relationship, then they're going to expect you to fulfill all of those roles that we talked about. So building trust is about building the expectation and understanding that you will deliver on what it is that you've promised to the team. It's taking care of the little things and catching the big things so your team doesn't have to do things like crunch or a lot of unnecessary rework. When I started at Evolve, we had a bunch of kind of grunt work stuff that had to happen. If you ever work with like Xbox and PlayStation, there are things like achievement files and trophy files and localization and presence, and that stuff really sucks to do. But they're just files that you have to maintain and update. I went ahead and took ownership of that because my engineers were like, I don't want to deal with it, and nobody else did, so I took that, and that was kind of partially how I was able to establish a lot of trust and gain respect for my coworkers at Turtle Rock. So you got to jump on a grenade, you have to catch a ball, volunteer to take tasks, basically show your team that you're not too good to do anything that helps the team out, but also recognize what's reasonable. Picking up your laundry is not reasonable. I can also talk about trust in game development for hours, but that's actually kind of it. So I have my Twitter here. I don't post very consistently. Right now there's a lot of Game of Thrones rage, but yeah, that's it. Any questions?
How often are people hired as producers, but only in a specific department? Like, do producers usually jump around or manage multiple departments at a time, or are there people who are only engineering producers, only art producers?
That's a really good question. So if not everybody heard it, she was asking how often are producers hired for specifically one department. So when I started at Turtle Rock, that was kind of the way that they wanted to do it. They wanted to bring in, and it happens pretty often, like you'll have a content producer or you'll have an engineering producer, but I've actually started thinking of it a different way and implementing it differently at Turtle Rock, which is I view it as feature producers or content producers, more an area of the game. So like we have a producer that overlooks maps, weapons, characters, and then someone that takes care of gameplay, networking, engine. It often ends up being department specific just because of the nature of those things, but I actually liked that a lot more because what I expect out of producers is accountability. So for me to be able to say to you, hey, you own maps from start to finish, that means you're working with concept artists, level designers, environment artists, VFX, audio, but you're taking care of the map because what we care that goes out to the public is that piece of content. So you need the one person to be accountable for it. When you do department-specific producers, which a lot of studios do, and this is not necessarily a bad thing depending on how it's handled, but something that can happen is like, I'm the concept art producer, and I only care about the concepts. I pass them off to the environment artist producer, and something can happen in that switch of hands where something is missed, something is forgotten, critical information is passed along, which is why I don't love it, because there's this assumption like, hey, this person's gonna catch the ball, but they didn't. Did that answer your question?
Hi, thanks for your talk. What's the situation with like the audio team at Turtle Rock? Do you have like a dedicated audio team? Do you usually outsource that kind of work? And what kind of things do you usually demand or ask of them?
That's a good question. So he's asking what kind of the setup is with our audio team. So right now our audio team is made up of 4 sound designers and 1 audio engineer. We have two game teams right now. We have our VR game team, which is working on a title that I can't talk about, so I don't know why I'm going there. That has 2 sound designers, and then our other, Back for Blood, has 2 sound designers as well. And then our audio engineer is actually part of a team that we refer to as Overhead, which is folks that help out on all projects. I'm on that, my tech director is. There's never been enough work for 1 audio programmer for 1 project in our experience. Maybe we're not doing enough cool stuff, but usually audio programming is actually an area that doesn't get a lot of love. It's really hard to find audio programmers. But we also use a lot of sound libraries. We work with casting groups and stuff for VO. And then music, it actually kind of depends. One of our sound designers is actually a very talented music composer. He made all the music for The Well and Journey of the Gods. And we might work with him for Back for Blood, but we also might work with a composer. So for Evolve, we worked with a composer. We've also done things like work with audio consultants. So one of the things that Warner Brothers wants to do with us is like shoot guns in a field so that we can gather that audio. So we'll do stuff like that too.
So you mentioned like when you're applying for companies, you should ask about crunches. What kind of crunches do you like ask? Like when do you know like a crunch is not really good?
If they say that crunch is inevitable, that's a problem. That should be your first one. But then ask them how they treat it. Some companies might tell you that they give you additional time off, like when you're crunching, you accrue vacation time at a higher rate. That sounds good. It's not, because you never get the opportunity to use it because you're always crunching towards the next title. So ask them just see how they talk about it too, and get a feel for that. Because I had interviewed with Rockstar and I had asked them about that, and I didn't like how they answered. I'm not gonna go into that, but
Thank you.
yeah. Any other questions? No?
Not really.
Not really. You have a comment?
Actually,
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, can you give me a general idea of what the relationship between producers and game designers look like?
So that's a really good question. So you asked what the relationship between producers and game designers looks like. There is always a point in the project where it is one of animosity. When you are leading up to shipping something or like a vertical slice delivery, game designers are going to want to keep changing because they want to be awesome. They want more work, they want more task work, and production wants bugs to be fixed. So sometimes they can kind of argue with each other about whether or not that's the thing that you should do. But that's only, it's occasionally, and I usually have to remind my team like, hey, we're here to like enable them and make an awesome game, and it's okay. but they're kind of they're your greatest enemy, and they're also your greatest ally. So a lot of it is you're negotiating with them, you're trying to get an understanding. They change their minds super often, which is okay. That's actually one of the reasons we don't utilize Scrum. Are a lot of you familiar with Agile or Scrum and how it works? Okay, so one of the big benefits out of Agile is that you agree to your amount of work, and then you work for the length of your sprint, and then you're able to generate data based off of what you got done, right? You figure out your velocity. At Turtle Rock, we play test the game every day. And that means the game design wants to change things every day. So we tried doing sprints, and we would have this list of work, and we were like, okay, we're gonna do this, and let's execute on the plan. And then 3 days in, or design would be like, I don't really want engineering to work on this right now. I'd much rather they work on this other thing that was super annoying in the playtest. So every benefit that you got out of the red tape of sprints kind of flew out the window. So we ended up abandoning it.
You mentioned Agile, Scrum, and also Jira. I was wondering what methodologies do you like using if you don't use Agile, and what tools do you like using?
So the way that we look at all the different methodologies out there are their toolboxes. So they have different mechanisms in them that make a lot of sense. So at Turtle Rock, one of the things we actually really like are stand-ups. We don't necessarily do a daily stand-up. Some of my teams do twice a week stand-up, but we do make sure that it's short. One of the important things of stand-up is literally in the name, it's stand-up. Do not let people sit down, because they'll just keep talking and talking and talking. So we actually have an engineering stand-up of 18 people, and it gets done in 8 minutes or less every day. So yes, and everybody speaks. But to add on to that, so in Jira, there's a Kanban board view that you can generate, so all of your tasks show up in a Kanban board, and you have different swim lanes based off of your workflow. One of the things that we do on the Back for Blood team with the engineers is their list of work is a prioritized stack. So the to-do column is controlled manually, we drag and drop, and an engineer knows that the thing at the top of their stack is the thing that we feel is most important for them to work on, so they kind of pluck that out. And the commitment that we make to them is we won't interrupt your work if you have something marked as in progress unless it's extremely urgent. And then we constantly move the stack around. But it's also a conversation. Like if the engineer looks at their stack and goes, oh, I have to do this thing 5 down to get this thing at the top done first, they let us know, and we're just like, okay, that's cool. We also use the Kanban boards for our content teams. So once you know how you're going to create a prop or a character, you're doing the same thing over and over. So they're just working through their list and moving it through the board. And we track the different statuses. So the cool thing with Jira is it's highly customizable. You can create a lot of your own issue types and workflows. So something we've done on some projects in the past is we actually had an issue type per asset type in the game, and then had a custom workflow, and then set up automated things. So like if I was working on a weapon and I was done with the high poly and the texture and I was ready for it to be reviewed, I would move it to the review status, and we would auto assign it to the art director so they knew to look at it. You can do a lot of really cool stuff. For some of the other methodologies, you could argue that when you get to the end of a project, it's kind of waterfall. You have a list of bugs and you just have to get through it. Like you burn through it. So one of the things that we do when we switch into that mode is I send out a daily report to the team, and I have a graph that shows this is how many bugs we have. This is when we have to get it at 0, and I draw a line. And then every day I update it and show where we're at. So usually with a project, it's actually pretty cool. All projects have done this. You'll have this big spike up, and then it'll go down. But we'll use that to motivate people. So not a whole lot of tools from all those, but you kind of you look at why you created a thing and think about the problem that you're trying to solve. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you providing any summer-related work opportunities?
Unfortunately, we don't do any internships at Turtle Rock. I think California law makes our GM uncomfortable with it. Sorry. I wish we did. One of the realities of Turtle Rock is that we're a very senior studio. A lot of the people that work there have a lot of experience in the industry. One of the things that we actually often see is we'll get people applying to senior positions that used to be art directors and just don't want to do that anymore. They just want to make games. So in some ways, we're a bit of a refuge for those folks. But I mentioned earlier, in production, I want to hire an AT with 0 games experience because what I want to try and do is enrich the game industry and get more of you guys in.
Okay. A couple quick questions. What does GM stand for? What does Kanban stand for?
So GM is general manager. So he's our general manager and our president. If you ask him what he does, he would tell you that he makes sure we have snacks. But really, he does the contract side of things and he manages the money. And then you said Kanban. So Kanban is, what's another term for Kanban, like lean? It's the idea that it's like an assembly line. The idea is that you have a known amount of work, you know how you have to get done, and you just have to work through it. So it's a little more elegant than that. I'm really like dumbing it down. Where it came from was actually like the auto industry with creating cars. They defined what it was, and it was a way of identifying where your bottlenecks were. Go ahead.
Okay. How much do you get involved, or your producers get involved with sort of micromanaging who's doing what tasks versus just giving tasks to like a team?
Okay, so the question was, how much do I or my producers get involved with figuring out who exactly gets a task, or as you correctly put it, micromanaging? It happens quite a bit at the lower level. If I get involved in that, something's going wrong, usually, if I have to deep dive and do that, or I might suggest things. But generally, it's my producers and senior producers in conjunction with leads. So we have a gameplay lead. We have a bunch of gameplay tasks. We'll sit down with them and say, hey, who's going to own what systems? And we try to give out the tasks based on system. But we also try to make sure that you don't just have one expert per system. So we might spread it around based on that. But as you get later in the project, it's actually really obvious who should work on what based off of what they've worked on in the past. Code reviews is something that can help a lot with ensuring that multiple people know a system, because something that can happen, which is not great, is like, oh, I don't want to fix a bug in that system that's not my system, that's Joe's. And you're like, no, we gave it to you for a reason. But so not super often unless we have to.
So how helpful are design documents when it comes to setting up the task and the deadline?
So the question was, how useful are design documents when it comes up to like setting up tasks or assessing your schedule? So design documents kind of decrease in value as the project goes on. Very early in the project, they're extremely valuable. But what we're at Turtle Rock really looking for is, what is the spirit of the feature? What is it trying to do? What are the goals? How is it interacting with other features? So we don't like things to get too detailed. On the flip side, the studio I worked at before, TimeGate, they loved design documents that wrote requirements, which were very specific about how the feature operated, like what could it do, what couldn't it do, and that actually served as a test plan for QA. So getting super detailed with your design docs can be helpful to an engineer or somebody that's starting out the work, but the more detailed they are, the harder they are to maintain because things will change as you keep working on the project. But we usually ask for like one-pagers or something like that from our designers, and then we do something called a kickoff meeting. So once a designer has generated like, this is what I want this feature to do, we gather everybody that's gonna work on the feature, VFX, audio, everything into a room. The game designer walks through their high-level design, and then everyone can ask questions.